Imagine you're selected for jury duty. You walk into a full courtroom, you get sworn in, and the opening statements begin. The prosecution gets up and tells you the defendant has a history of arson, stalking, threats, and violence, especially towards women who have rejected him. They promise to bring witnesses who feared him, an ex who says he threatened her for months, and family to explain how the victim was growing more scared of him before disappearing. They'll end with telling you, when you examine all of the individual pieces, the timeline, the motive, and the history of the defendant, it will reveal a complete picture that points only to the defendant's guilt. But then the defense stands. They tell you there is no DNA, there are no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no real connection to where the victim was found. They argue police became so desperate to solve the case that they developed tunnel vision around this one suspect while the real answers got away from them, ending their part with the evidence will not point to guilt. In fact, it points to a complete lack of credible evidence that the state's offered you a puzzle with half of the pieces missing, and they're asking you to guess at the picture. And this is not enough to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So, on a jury, for a murder case that only has circumstantial evidence, what would you need? Or how much would you need to say, yes, absolutely, this person is guilty? There is no way, there is no chance that someone else realistically had done this. Well, for this case, a trial never took place because nearly everything against the defendant was just that, suspicion, a coincidence at best. And a lot of what we're going to cover in here likely wouldn't have been things allowed in court in order to keep it a fair trial. Today, we will be talking about Cheryl Morris, a 31-year-old woman who disappeared in Kansas City, Missouri in 1981. And she had never been seen alive again, or at all, until nearly 6 years after her disappearance. We're going to follow a similar format of the other cases we've gone over, starting with a history of what we know about Cheryl and what happened to her. Then we will briefly cover who the main suspect was and why he was being suspected. But as always, before fully jumping in, I do want to make it clear that the purpose of this video is not to point fingers at anyone or claim that anyone is guilty. I'm just trying to compile everything I could find through various sources about Cheryl and her case into one video. But this is true crime. We're going to be talking about real crime, and some of the topics and descriptions mentioned in this will be disturbing to hear, so listener discretion is advised. But without further ado, we'll start at the beginning with Nelson William Morris, or Bill as he preferred to be called. He was an aviation radio man in the Navy during World War II. He had spent 18 months in the South Pacific just after that decision was made that Allied forces would begin taking an offensive approach against Japan. During his time there, Bill had been shot down on at least 3 occasions. And to add to how incredibly lucky it was to survive that 3 times, he was also the only one from the crew each time that managed to survive. A little over a year after returning to the States, Bill had married Alice Rosemary Godman, September 1st of 1945. The two of them spent 21 years together before divorcing in 1966, where they both eventually remarried. But during their time together, they welcomed 2 children into the world, Michelle Morris in 1948 and Cheryl Morris, who was born May 1st of 1950. Cheryl had grown up on a family farm in Belton, Missouri, and Cheryl, she seems like such a cool girl. I think I would have loved her if I had ever had the chance to meet her. And not just because she listened to rock music or because she played in an all girl rock band in high school, but she also loved horses. And those are all things that would instantly make me like someone or think that they're more cool before even getting to know them. Well, growing up on the farm, she had a horse named Maria that she at one point had actually taken to competitions and won ribbons at American Royal with, which American Royal is local to Missouri. They hold competitions there, but they are kind of a big deal. People from all over the US will come out to compete in equestrian competitions there. She also had that like 60s, 70s hippie style, the thick leather belts, floral or really busy patterned shirts, bell bottoms. It was her vibe and she wore it confidently. I mean, she was just a confident woman, though. She was the kind of girl who loved life and was really optimistic. She was really close with her family and she loved being around them and sharing her life with them. She did, however, like a lot of Midwesterns, she spent a few years away from Missouri in her 20s. She had moved out to LA, but still, she did come back home and visit. Like when her sister was married in 1974, she had come back out to attend the wedding as maid of honor. And it's very likely she had come back out in October of 1975 when her biological father had passed away. After that, she spent 5 more years in California. And when she had decided to come back to Belton in 1980, she had made the decision to pursue a degree in landscape horticulture, which her mother, Alice, she actually loved gardening. So that may have been something that planted the seed, if you will, for Cheryl to grow up wanting to learn more about the science and art behind growing plants. She ended up settling on attending a local college. That way, she would be able to stay close to her family and home while attending school. And while she was in college in 1981, she had also started working as a server at a local Mexican or like Tex Mex restaurant called Patrico's, which I'm sure was a very good choice for her. She was the kind of person who would have done really well when it came to earning tips, being that she was very social, very enthusiastic, in that kind of way that it would rub off on you, right? Like she had that excited energy that you couldn't help but to smile about when you were around it. This is also the place where she would end up meeting Robert Gross, one of her coworkers' sons. He was around her age, just a couple years younger, but being such an optimist and having that genuine excitement about her, Cheryl really stood out to people and it made them want to befriend her, to be around her. And for Robert, it was no different. He really liked Cheryl and eventually he got the opportunity to take her out a couple times. Now, Robert, he's described as being a little weird, but handsome nonetheless. And he could be quite charming. He really enjoyed spending money on the girls that he liked and taking them out. But as charming as he was, Cheryl ended up cutting things off with him pretty quickly. They didn't mesh right. She didn't like all of the sexual advances he would make. He made her a little uncomfortable. And I don't think anyone is ever prepared for someone to react to a breakup the way that Robert did. This guy seemed to have some major insecurities over rejection because soon after the breakup, Robert had allegedly began calling Cheryl constantly, both at work and at home, insisting that she go back out with him. And time after time, she would say no. And he just could not accept that. And while that's happening, there was always something new going on with Cheryl's car. And not little things either. Because I know you could argue one time, maybe it's just some crazy teens being a bit wild, it's not targeted. But when things start to stack up, it's hard to justify that everything isn't related somehow. She would come out of work and all of her tires would be slashed, all four of them. Another day, her headlights and taillights weren't working, and it turned out somebody had gone through and actually cut the wires to them. Another time, she was having weird issues with her car. It would have been stalling out, unable to stay at high speeds if she could even get it over 10 miles an hour. And a friend had even said that her carburetor had caught fire. And when she had taken it in to have it looked at, it turned out that somebody had put sugar in her gas tank. Now, there's no evidence for who did this. So I'm not making an accusation here, but it is a popular belief that Robert was the one responsible for vandalizing her car. Cheryl did start to have this growing fear, wondering how long this was going to go on for. Worried about the vandalism, that it meant something, and just not being able to understand exactly what message was supposed to be sent for her, what this was supposed to mean. Still, despite all of this going on, what she's having to deal with, she wasn't allowing it to really keep her down. She was still going out, going to work, attending school. She was even still making plans with friends. But come November, exam prep had officially started for school, and Cheryl had planned with a friend to get together, that she was going to stay overnight and the two of them would study together once she had finished up working for the day. So, November 4th, after changing out of her waitress uniform and into more comfortable clothes, she had called her friend around 9:30 to let her know that she was headed out from Patrico's and would be on her way over now. Cheryl then made the 6-minute drive to her friend's house, but she was never seen again. She never made it inside. The next day, her Pontiac was found in the parking area around the apartment complex. Her friend had noticed it outside when leaving and had actually called Cheryl's mom and stepfather to see what was going on. There was that sinking feeling creeping in that Cheryl was missing. Immediately, Cheryl's family was seeing the red flags. They had known what she had been dealing with, and they had known it was unlike her to just abandon her car and skip out on her plans with someone like this. She had always been very reliable, so they went and filed a missing persons report that day. There was a squad of 4 investigators put on the missing persons case. In addition to this, she had friends and coworkers who put together their own search party, walking through the woods, searching stream beds in the area for any sign of Cheryl or clues of what may have happened to her. Police had searched Cheryl's car, which had been left unlocked, and things seemed to mostly be in order, although her school books and her waitress uniform were not found and have never been. But a week in, when newspapers started releasing the missing person articles for Cheryl, police had no suspects. Cheryl had become another missing person who disappeared each year and didn't turn back up in that first week, which was demoralizing for a lot of her friends. I mean, at this point, some of them had even started talking about her in the past tense when interviewed. But Alice, Cheryl's mother, and some others in her family really tried to hold on to that hope that maybe one day Cheryl would return home safely, especially after reports had come in claiming that people had seen her hitchhiking to California, and even evidence that her ID had been scanned out there after her disappearance. Now, again, they didn't really believe that she would just get up and run off like that. But when you're looking at a situation like this, most people, I think, would be hopeful their loved one was okay and was out there somewhere. But even with that hope, they really wanted Cheryl's disappearance thoroughly investigated because it was very out of character for her. And with all of the happenings going on in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, it was suspicious to say the least. And of course, Robert was eventually mentioned to police, but when they had gone to talk to him, he was very evasive. He didn't want to talk to them. He wouldn't allow them in the home. And the only thing he would tell police is that he had known Cheryl, but he denied ever dating her. It really seemed like he was minimizing his involvement in her life. Well, a year later, he had gotten into some more trouble. He had caused an explosion of a house in North Kansas City and was also being taken to court by his ex-girlfriend, which we'll get into a little bit more later. But this all prompted a search of his house, which had lasted over 30 hours. And in that search, they had found 2 handwritten letters that police believed made direct references to Cheryl. Now, this isn't enough to really change the current trajectory of Cheryl's missing person investigation, but nonetheless, it did make Robert even more of a person of interest on her case. Police continued looking for Cheryl with the hope of getting her home safely, making trips to follow up on leads in California or anywhere where they popped up. Occasionally, when items were found police thought could be connected to Cheryl, they would go by and see Alice or Richard, her stepfather, asking if they had recognized anything because they were always trying to keep their mind open for different possibilities. But nothing ever came from any lead, no scrap of clothing found. They were stuck, and the case had been inactive for a while by 1987. And that's when the next big thing happens. September 3rd of 1987, Cheryl would be found in Cass County, Kansas City, only 20 miles from where she had disappeared. And really, she was almost found years earlier. Back in 1983, the fire department had responded to a fire at an abandoned home in Raymore, but with the cold weather and really only needing to contain the fire and keep it from spreading, they were able to get it under control rather quickly with the stores they had on the trucks, and they didn't need to access the nearby cistern for additional water supply, making it so that cistern wasn't open until 1987. When in passing, Scott Porter, who was with his child collecting firewood, decided he would take the opportunity to educate his son on the dangers of cisterns. In doing so, he removed the cement cover to show him how deep they could be, and immediately they saw a body wrapped in newspapers floating in the water. They left the scene and called the police right away. And one of the first officers at the scene there was Under Sheriff Tom Cook. He immediately had an idea of who they may have found. Just off his own memory, there were two women missing that still really weighed on him, heavily enough to think of them without even pulling up opened or cold cases. One of those being Cheryl Morris. Coincidentally, he actually worked on her case initially when she disappeared before transferring to the Cass County Sheriff's Office in 1984. Well, once he and the other personnel needed arrived on the scene, they began extracting the body from the water. And it was clear that she had been here for quite some time based on the level of decomposition. It had taken hours to recover her body. And since it had skeletalized at this point, they even had to drain the water down to about 6 inches after the first day to fully recover her whole body and attempt to find any other evidence that may have been put in there. And once dental records were able to be compared, it was confirmed Cheryl Morris did not run off to California, abandoning her family, friends, and educational pursuits. She had never left Missouri at all. She'd been murdered, strangled, actually. Suspected that she had been decapitated as well. She was then wrapped in newspapers, dated at the latest 1981, before being left in an abandoned cistern only a handful of miles away from her home. And this news was a roller coaster for the family. They had really been holding on to hope that she was okay. And even when she was first discovered, the earlier reports were estimating she was 4 to 6 inches taller, possibly a redhead. So there was that, like, oh my, this could be her. To no way, that doesn't fit. Cheryl's 5'2", she's blonde. But then when the dental records come back, and it's just this wave of emotions over a few days that ended with devastating news. From here, though, the investigation into what happened to Cheryl picked up full force. The Cass County Sheriff's Office formed a new squad of 4, then 6 deputies to investigate what's now become a homicide investigation. Early on, they were feeling confident about results. This team included Tom Cook, who they felt gave them a bit of a leg up on the investigation since he was already so familiar with the case and had a good rapport with the family. And it's not totally relevant, but there was another detective on this squad whose name is familiar here. Jerry Cassidy also worked on Cheryl's homicide investigation. Well, the same day that this squad was announced, it was also reported that they had a very strong suspect who was still living in the Kansas City area, that Cheryl had known them, and they commented that they were unsure if this was a unrequited lover. Still, they acknowledged that they would have to begin re-interviewing friends and family, since at that time they did not have enough to make a case. They estimated it would take months before getting enough together to bring formal charges. But anyway, the same day this squad was first announced, they also reported that they had a very strong suspect, someone who is still living in the Kansas City area who Cheryl had known. They did comment on there that they were unsure if it was an unrequited lover. Still, they acknowledged they would have to begin re-interviewing friends and family, since at the time they did not have enough to make a case. And they had estimated it would take a few months before having enough together to bring formal charges. Well, not even a week later, really just one day after the most recent update article was published about this one big suspect in mid-September, the tone shifted a bit. Police clarifying that this is not a matter of simply connecting Cheryl's death to one specific person. They were afraid some were maybe getting a bit of tunnel vision at the fact that they had a strong suspect, and they didn't want the public to have the wrong impression of what was going on. Correcting that they have a main suspect who is serving time in prison in Indiana for drug charges. And that suspect is, in fact, an ex of Cheryl's, while also admitting it may not be him. So they're keeping options open, and they have at least one other suspect. And here it seems like they're starting to get a little more tight-lipped about the investigation, and understandably so. I mean, I've never been an investigator, but I know it's pretty common to try to keep the information private until the police are able to bring charges, or just have it come out in court for various reasons, but always to protect the investigation. Anyway, the investigation was slow. Trying to reconnect with everyone they needed to interview was a bit of a challenge, since it had been 6 years at this point. People had moved away, they'd changed their numbers, so there was that added task of tracking everyone down. Of course, after so much time, this is expected. But that extra effort, it was worth it. They did turn up new leads, and they had even interviewed someone who wasn't initially talked to. They came forward on their own after hearing about Cheryl's body being discovered, but they had never pushed for an interview before, assuming police already knew what they had to say, which led to various pleas from police for anyone with any information to contact the Cass County Police Department. No matter how small, in any situation like this, it's always a good idea to reach out. I mean, you never really know what the police know. And you never know if that one small thing that you know could bring everything together. And based off the information from their new source that had come forward, police set up an interview with the new suspect, who had agreed to come in and take a polygraph test, since over the years he had allegedly made some statements that made it seem like he had known something about what happened that November night. Over the next month, though, this guy had disappeared. Police tried for several weeks to make contact with him. He kept canceling their planned interviews until eventually the police couldn't locate him at all. He was in the wind. There was still a little momentum at this point, though, since while preparing for that interview, there was a small breakthrough. They had sent off some soil samples to a lab from the area Cheryl was found in that came back to closely match soil samples taken from their initial suspect's shoes years prior. You know, the man that's in prison in Indiana. And all through this, the police were wanting to talk to him as well, but he refused to cooperate with the investigation or be interviewed. They sent the soil samples out again to be re examined just to be sure. Then The next year, in October of 1988, police announced that they would be presenting the case to prosecutors the following month to charge Robert Gross in Cheryl's murder. But it just wasn't enough. What they would have been presenting is his connection to Cheryl, them briefly dating and her ending it, the alleged calls and threats that she received from him, potentially those notes that they had found in his home, and maybe that soil sample evidence from his boots being comparable to the area Cheryl was found. There's nothing I could find specifically saying they weren't bringing charges or the prosecution declined to move forward with approving the case. So it is possible they decided to wait longer or try to gather more information, something like that. But years go by and it's 1992. Robert is coming up for a parole hearing, and more evidence is found. When going through old dispatch reports, they find two reports made in 1982 about suspicious activity only half a mile from the cistern Cheryl had been found in. Not only that, but they were able to get a description of the vehicle and the license plate number, which matched exactly with Robert and his vehicle. With this and suspicion of Robert being involved in other homicides in the area, they were able to finally sit down with him in prison and record an interview. Which this was perfect timing. It actually delayed Robert's parole hearing, partially because the new evidence and severe charges that he was looking at, but also the interview tape with who knows what on it had been misplaced. And that was something that the Kansas City police were really needing to examine before formally pushing those charges through. Well, soon after these events, a grand jury is selected, and they're expecting to look at Cheryl's case. But it's not what you think. It's being looked at in relation to an investigation into criminal activity by the Cass County Sheriff's Office. And this is where things really hit a wall for Cheryl's case. And we're going to dive a little deeper into this just because in the last case we covered about Bruce Miller, we had talked about Jerry Cassidy. And he is involved in this situation. And I think it gives a little bit of insight into how or why he changed so much and why this situation had such a lasting impact on him. But I am going to try to keep it only as detailed as it needs to be for the full context on why it was a big deal, but I don't want to take the focus too much off of Cheryl. But the trial had taken place in 1994. The sheriff, Homer Foote, was accused of misappropriating funds, falsifying evidence, tampering with records, unlawful detention. He had even been facing a civil suit with an employee for disregarding her claims of sexual harassment at work. Well, during the trial, Tom Cook, the star undersheriff who had worked on Cheryl's missing person case and her homicide investigation, was also being accused of falsifying evidence. The relevant charges here we're actually looking more at Tom for, really. Deputy Bill Crawford came forward first, accusing Tom of instructing him to lie on a report in a drunk driving incident, which Bill later pled guilty to falsifying that paperwork. When this happened, Jerry had one of those moments where he had remembered going into Homer's office while him and Tom were looking over the dispatch sheets in relation to Cheryl's disappearance. So Jerry, while looking at the sheet showing the license plate number and car description, he noticed that it looked different from all the other entries on the page and outwardly said, "Tom, that kind of looks like your handwriting." And Tom's face, according to Jerry, had just turned red and he glared at Jerry. What's more is those logs had been gone over prior to this incident, and this record was not found then. Under examination at trial, a Secret Service document analyst testified that two of the three entries on the 1982 call sheet that were allegedly falsified were written in ink that was not commercially available until 1986. 4 years after it was supposedly written. Now, this trial, though, it is into Homer and looking at trying to kick him out of office. So, what they were trying to prove here is documents are falsified, and Homer had knowledge of this. There are a few things that kind of make me think he may have, right? First, he admits he kept a picture of Cheryl on his computer calendar to remind himself that Robert was a dangerous man who needed to be caught. He's also quoted at one point saying something along the lines of, "We've almost got him. We just need a little bit more." And he did have more of a Midwestern way of saying it, but that was the gist. Also, Homer and Tom were very close. That's the sheriff and the undersheriff. They worked closely with each other. They looked over the logs together. He didn't seem to question anything when Jerry spoke up. And there were other charges related to Tom's son, also a deputy, that seemed to just be ignored by Homer. I mean, he even refused to have someone take Tom's place as acting sheriff as the trial had gone on. And he remained head investigator on Cheryl's case while all these accusations were coming out and happening at court. Well, this led Jerry, Bill, and another officer who came forward and testified to being put on unpaid leave until the courts forced them to be allowed back at work, where they were still stuck working in a hostile work environment under a man who very much did not want them there. And some of those accusations were actually made more towards him than his buddy that was on trial. I think it's possible, at the very least, he had some idea that Tom was capable and willing to do things like this. The both of them seemed to bend the rules a little bit when they felt it was necessary. Although there is a later interview from around 2020 where Homer was still standing firm that he did not believe the call sheets were faked at all, and definitely did not believe that Tom would have done that. Well, all three of the officers ended up retiring or leaving the force while the trial was ongoing or just after it had ended with a verdict for Homer to be kicked out of office. But this stopped Cheryl's case from going to court. Even if what they had before was enough, and it's incredibly sad because it's likely that Robert could be responsible for Cheryl's death. But with the claims of falsified evidence, especially in a circumstantial trial, it really messes up the chances of being able to bring this to court. It will always be a strong element to bring up and could even bring more points of, well, since this piece of evidence was falsified, how can we trust similar pieces of evidence? Anything that could have been planted or altered, completely fabricated, it almost hands the defense a strong case on their part for supporting that there could be reasonable doubt. But here are some things that Robert has been accused of that could indicate he was the one responsible. As far as a violent history, he was suspected of killing a couple in 1979. Much like with Cheryl's case, though, there was never any smoking gun found that would put him away for it. In this situation, Robert had dated a woman, Wanda, who left him to rekindle things with her marriage. Allegedly, Robert had told a friend that he was going to confront Wanda about how he felt played by her. After that, Wanda and her husband were found shot and killed in her home. When there was that big search of his house, they had found similar guns used in that murder in his possession. There was another ex, Teresa, who, for years after dating Robert in 1983, drowned in her swimming pool, which was ruled an accident, but police did receive a tip later on that around the time of her death, she had written to a friend that Robert had come back into her life. I mean, as far as her husband knew, though, they hadn't had contact in many years. And the only story he could think of that really stuck out to him about Robert was how one time he had set Teresa's closet on fire when they had a fight. Which, I don't know. I don't know Teresa, right? But that doesn't seem like the kind of story you would tell when thinking fondly of someone, or something you'd remember and be like, That's the kind of guy I want to reconnect with. But to be real, it doesn't mean that it's out of the realm of possibility that she had reconnected with Robert. You know, when you like someone with time, it gets easier to wonder, like, they may have changed or calmed down since then, or even play with the idea of just being friends based on that once upon a time you really mattered to me. And I'm not interested in the same thing anymore, but I could be a part of your life, especially if it was some like high school romance, right? Well, there was another time where he had been taken to court by his ex, Dana. And this was a little after Cheryl disappeared, eerily similar in some ways. Just how it's alleged, Robert was calling Cheryl and harassing her, and it's believed he was responsible for sabotaging her car. Well, Dana broke things off with Robert, and he had called her the same way, threatening to torture her, threatening to sexually assault her, to kill her and everyone that she loved. Calls were traced back, being able to verify that Robert was the one making those calls. She also had similar problems with her car being sabotaged. And from this, Robert was charged in making terroristic threats to her. And she ended up moving out of state, changing her name to stay hidden from him, which I feel shows just how scary that man was once you were no longer in his good graces. And I mean, all she did was break up with him. That's it. It was around this time that he was hospitalized for those burns in relation to the house explosion and his home was searched. There was also a neighbor that believed after a dispute with him, he had went and burned down their home while they were out of town. And then if we fast forward to the 2000s, he would go into massage parlors, requesting sexual favors, demanding it at times, refusing to leave when asked. He made a lot of women uncomfortable. And in 2016, an employee of a massage parlor, Ying Li, was killed. She was stabbed and decapitated. And then the apartment that she was living in was set on fire, wiping out any chances of solid evidence. Then in 2017, various massage parlor employees suspected him of damaging their vehicles, putting screws in the tires, keying the vehicles. He had even broken the windows out of another one. And after all that, he was sexually harassing the manager of a shop, and it was recorded on video and audio. Robert was followed and eventually arrested. They searched his home again. They found a list of workers that he had their names, numbers, where he could find them, addresses. And that last one is what got him arrested on several charges of stalking, firearm possession, especially with already being a felon. In 2019, Robert, at age 67, was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which it's actually been amended to just 30 years due to insufficient evidence on two of the other crimes. His lawyer, also another little fact, is the same lawyer Jerry Cassidy instructed his family to bring that briefcase to. So there's just another little connection there. But just a few other brief notes that don't add too much value, but I did want to mention them. When Robert was profiled against a serial killer's profile, they did say that his criminal history did fit that of a serial killer's. And personally, I think it's possible, if he is responsible for everything he's suspected of, that he may have liked that the police kind of knew that it was him, but couldn't get him on anything. He could have sent in the tip about Teresa and him reconnecting. And I think that he may have burned that house down near the cistern where Cheryl was found, wanting her to be discovered, wanting his crime to be talked about, but didn't want to push things too far when the fire idea didn't work out. But I mean, that is baseless speculation on my part. Again, I have no credentials to be making any kind of accusations, and I'm not an expert in investigating. But that is something that I wondered while reading up on him and looking into that. So, with everything Robert's been suspected of and charged with, it makes it hard to believe personally, for me at least, that he wasn't responsible for Cheryl's death. But really trying to put myself on a jury and having a defense attorney telling me about all this falsified evidence and about other suspects that had made statements alluding to be involved or having knowledge about what happened, just running off, never being interviewed, never being able to be found by police. I don't know. I really feel like the evidence thing would really make me question every other suspicion, or like I said before, like anything that could have potentially been faked or planted, coupled with he's suspected of so much. He's been on your radar for so long and nothing solid has ever been found. It almost sounds like they just want to put this man away for something because they couldn't solve this or that. And I feel like it's possible that they could convince me of that. I mean, looking at everything laid out like this, I feel pretty convinced on on how I feel about Robert's guilt, but I hate that. I hate that not knowing. I hate that having to have a doubt there in any capacity. I'd love to know how anyone else feels though. Like if all of this were given to you at a trial, would you have any doubt or like enough to at least say like not guilty? Am I just in my head about thinking I could be convinced? I don't know. I do think that one day I may dive into all of Robert's crimes. That may be a thing that I do in parts similar to this, where the other victims will have their own stories told and with care as well as I can. And if I do that, I'll make like a Robert playlist for it. Well, they'll all be stored together. But today, this is Cheryl's story. This is what I could find on her in her life. And since Cheryl's disappearance and murder, her mother and stepfather, Alice and Richard Eaton, have both passed on, never seeing anyone held accountable for Cheryl's murder. Frustrated and confused more and more as Robert, the main suspect, stands accused of so much and still able to be out hurting more people for years. Frustrated that Cheryl lost her life after Robert was already suspected of two other murders years before he ever crossed paths with Cheryl. I couldn't imagine the rage that I would hold after being told something like this, especially if police were promising me justice, just to turn around and tell me, well, we're pretty sure it's this guy, we just can't do anything about it. And I'm sure that this confident feeling the police had that Robert was guilty may have been something that lingered for Jerry Cassidy. And that could have played a part into his downfall of later feeling like he needed to take justice into his own hands, knowing that some monsters just get away with things far longer than they ever should. Seeing those faults in our justice system in regard to policies that were put in place for fairness to avoid others being falsely accused and tried, though important, it could potentially be a bit flawed. Cheryl was 31. She got to live her fun young adult life in LA. And when she came home to start her responsible adult life, she was getting her degree. She carried straight A's. She was working, planning, living, and enjoying her life, regardless of anything that was thrown at her. Her life and her future were stolen from her when she still had so much to do and so much to live for. And I always feel weird ending these. What is there to say? I always want to strike some kind of chord and make somebody feel, like really, really feel, not leave like this is just a story, a piece of history, but an awful reality that so many people have to live with. But thank you for being here and not for choosing me to listen to, but thank you for taking the time to give Cheryl a spotlight today because she deserves at least that much.